Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the 2002 albums from Drexciya, Harness the Storm and Grava 4. Alright, I think it's finally time to wrap up reviews of the main Drexciya albums, and what with there only being two left to cover, and those two being released in the same year, I decided to group them together in the same video. Not to mention, I feel like these two may be loosely thematically connected. See, these albums were apparently at one point advertised to be part of a series of 7 albums the duo put together around the time, 7 storms, if you will. Although these were the only ones to be released under the Drexciya name, everything else was apparently released under other aliases. Now, to be absolutely clear, the fuller details of what the other albums in this series actually are seems to be up for debate. I've seen people heavily theorize that the series includes the album they did under the Abstract Thoughts alias, or some of James Stinson's solo albums under other names like The Other People Place, Labrat XL, or Translusion. And to be honest, I'm actually not sure if Grava 4 is officially part of that series either. News articles around the time Harness the Storm was reissued on Trezor in 2014 imply that that was the only one in this series to be credited under the Drexciya name. Really, I kind of group these two together in my mind, like out of my own gut feelings based on the sonic similarities they share and the sort of departure in sound they represent away from the widely varied retro-electro sketches of the Quest era or the more accessible material on Neptune's Lair, towards less melodic, more open-ended, loosely atmospheric, and longer-winded, semi-experimental techno arrangements. Both projects more similar to each other by my ears than they are to any of the other projects they ever put out under the Drexciya name, even if both projects definitely delivered different enough ideas to feel distinct from each other. Now, another reason I decided to group these two projects together in the same video is because, honestly, neither of them give me nearly as much to say or break down as either the Quest or Neptune's Lair. That's not a statement on their quality, but there's 19 total tracks between these two projects, which is still fewer tracks than Neptune's Lair. And it's not like the lengthier compositions on these albums translate to these tracks taking you on more interesting journeys or making more use of their length through further development. They're just longer. Any given cut on Harness the Storm or Grava 4 has about exactly as much progression as any other Drexciya track, but the ideas, I guess, happen to repeat more times to end up with tracks that most frequently stretch on past 5 or 6 minutes, or even a handful going on 7 or 8 minutes, which is more par for the course as far as this style of techno records go. That does perhaps unfortunately mean that these albums don't feel nearly as detailed or lived in as the Quest or Neptune's Lair. They don't have the same appeal for me of feeling like they're setting up this aquatic technological environment, and were never able to connect with me on quite as deep a level. Harness the Storm in particular, I remember hearing back in my high school days out of seeing it attracting a comparable level of popularity to their previous work, if not just possibly being their most popular album. Again, it is very close, if that. I know Pitchfork decided to highlight that one over any other Drexciya project when making a list of their 50 best IDM albums many years ago. And I remember back when I first heard Harness the Storm, I just didn't get much out of it at all, if I'm being honest. I found it to be pretty dull, and to this day, I would still probably mark it as my personal least favorite of the 4 major full-length Drexciya projects. But just as was the case with Neptune's Lair, I did gain more appreciation for it over time, and by this point I feel like I can get enough out of the experience to at least call it a good album. I'd say it's definitely the most background music-y of the Drexciya albums, at least for me, and there are still moments that never really clicked with me that much, but there is definitely some quality on display here to still easily make it worth checking out. It's still some solidly well-made, retro-futuristic techno and electro that fits well into the Drexciyan universe and expands upon it into territory that other Drexciya projects don't cover. In particular, the way the album starts is really strong. Undersea Disturbances is a great opener, with all these shimmering melodic textures being layered over marching drum machine beats. There may not really be much of a hook to this track, but it has more of a loose and almost improvisational feel to it that's very easy to get swept up in, and definitely evokes being like out in the middle of the ocean with waves crashing around you. And I've also grown to enjoy the second track, Digital Tsunami, on a comparable level as well. Any melodies that appear on this one feel significantly more muted, but they still just barely form a nice hook to go over this really driving synth bass line that feels really exciting and propulsive and creates a lot of forward momentum. The rest of the album admittedly doesn't hit for me on the same level as those first two tracks, and the remainder can be a little hit and miss, but there's still plenty of cool ideas here and there. A track like Soul of the Sea feels pretty experimental and creates a lot of unnerving and unstable atmosphere out of its groaning bass rumbles, wiry chord stabs, and squeaky synth plucks. Tracks like Song of the Green Whale and Lake Haze have a more marching electro beats with muted synth chords playing over them to create that hazy feeling in a marginally more accessible manner. The former of those two is one of the comparatively brighter or more comforting tracks, even if that's not really saying much. And all the squirty effects around it still retain the off-kilter and emotionally ambiguous vibe. And the latter of those two is probably the closest one of these tracks comes to sounding like something out of the Quest era, with some vague resemblance to their old classic cuts like You Don't Know, among others. Probably the track on the album that grew on me the most the more times I listened to it for this video. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mark Mission to Ociya, Syndor, and Back as a particular highlight. This track doesn't feature any tune or melody, at all, but instead swerves into significantly darker territory, surrounding you with lots of undulating bass with all sorts of different experimental textures that squelch and squirt around it. It feels really strange, but really well detailed and fascinating to listen to. Probably my third favorite track on the album behind the first two. There are, however, also a handful of moments on this album that, as mentioned before, still don't do much for me. Right in the middle of the project, there's two tracks which always pretty clearly cemented themselves as my personal least favorites on the project. Being Dr. Blowfin's Black Storm Stabilizing Spheres and The Plankton Organization. I mean, very cool titles, but these are easily the two tracks that feel like they have the least sonically going on here, and are the point at which the album most feels like it's dragging on for me. Though I would get it if other people got into these tracks a lot more than I did. Dr. Blowfin's Black Storm Stabilizing Spheres has a lot of heavy bass and fittingly makes for another one of the album's darkest moments. I would get it if you found the heaviness alone to be satisfying enough to work for you, although I do personally find the way they go up against those experimental clicking effects to grate on my nerves a bit, and hit on this unpleasant and sour note that's just not that fun for me to listen to. The Plankton Organization at least has a fair bit more forward momentum with much stronger and more propulsive beat work, one of the more danceable tracks on the album, I suppose. Although that track feels like it has even less going on, with almost nothing but this single squirty bass riff repeating over and over to layer on top of it, and that's about it. It's kinda cool initially, but it kinda wears out on me by the time the track finishes. Both of these tracks always felt very static and empty to me and failed to really capture my interest with the textures they were able to provide. Although again, I do very much suspect I'm in the minority on that take, and most people I've seen were able to mess with these moments just fine. I also found the track Aquatic Cataclysm, while less obviously empty feeling, to probably be the track on the album that most easily fell in the background. The rounder bass arpeggios and somewhat sneakier beat patterns do create more of a sense of movement, but the textures going into it just didn't really stand out in greater context of the album or grab my attention in any particular way. But that leaves the album's closer, Birth of New Life, which returns to brighter and more accessible melodies trying to hit on a strong and chilling emotional finish. It sort of feels like it's bringing the album around full circle. This is another big fan favorite, and it's obvious to see why, given it's easily the track on the album with the most coherent tune. Although, while this track was easily able to sit among the highlights on my first few re-listens of this album, for whatever reason it didn't end up sticking with me as much, and I ended up feeling less enthusiastic about it the more times I heard it. And I would not be able to explain to you in words why that happened. I mean, it's a sufficiently satisfying ending to the album and a good tune, just not one of my personal favorites, I guess. I don't know. But that's everything on Harness the Storm. It's a good album. I enjoy it. There's a handful of their best ever tracks, and even the parts that connect with me the least, I do understand why they connect more with other people. But it is still an album that as a whole, I'm left wishing I enjoyed as much as most other people seem to. I still find it to be a bit hit and miss, with certain moments hitting a fair bit more than others, and I've never been fully convinced of it really being the duo's best work. So I'm feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. Quite good, just not exemplary for me. So that takes us to the duo's final work together, which came out only a few months after Harness the Storm, Grava 4. Now, Grava 4 is by some distance the least popular of the 4 full-length projects that came out under the Drexciya name. Whenever people recommend Drexciya in passing, lots of people will say you should start with the quest, lots of people say to start with Neptune's Lair, lots of people say to start with Harness the Storm. Almost nobody will tell you to start with Grava 4. This has long been this odd black sheep in their catalog that just doesn't get highlighted nearly as often as the others. And I have no idea why that's the case. I mean, if you ask me, this album is actually a pretty solid improvement on the ideas that Harness the Storm set down. Yet another reason I decided to group this in the same video as Harness the Storm is because I had a feeling less people would be willing to watch a separate video on Grava 4, which is a real shame since it's very good. Perhaps the comparative lack of attention this album gets might be stemmed from the concept not being as unique. Like where the other Drexciya records always tried to play into this imagined high-tech aquatic environment, which was a lot more unique to them, obviously. Grava 4 takes the Drexciyan lore into outer space, which is a much more commonplace sci-fi setting. There's absolutely no shortage of space-themed records in this genre out there, so perhaps that meant this project didn't stand out as much to people at the time or something. Additionally, some of the text in the packaging explaining this album's place in the lore is a little odd looking back on it. It tells of Earth having found the Drexciyan home universe of Utopia and the home planet the Drexciyans come from. And in response, Dr. Blofin is given orders to activate the 7-dimensional cloaking spheres to hide the locations of the surrounding planets. Drexciya now being established as a different planet from Earth does admittedly seem to directly contradict the previously established lore of the Drexciyan race being descendants of pregnant slave women who were thrown overboard during the transatlantic slave trade. Unless their technology secretly got so advanced that the entire race was able to escape to this far-off part of the universe and form their civilization there instead. Which is kinda how I always took the album's concept anyway, like it was meant to be about their journey escaping to the one place that hasn't been corrupted by capitalism, as it were. Even if that blurb seems to possibly imply they'd always been living out in space. I don't know. In any case, regardless of how this album fits into the Drexciyan lore, the actual music on this album takes the more colorless and gray-feeling sound palette that was present on Harness the Storm, and twists it around into more interesting and experimental shapes that don't sound quite like anything else released under the Drexciya name. Some really cool developments on the ideas that older releases set down. For instance, this album starts with this especially odd experimental ambient cut called Cascading Celestial Giants, which stretches on for over 8 minutes, and has this intriguing mix of dark and brooding synth choir pads, wobbling bass, slowly lumbering and off-kilter percussion, and some blipping arpeggios. This is definitely an opener that communicates Grava 4 won't just be your everyday traditional electro record. And while there are still plenty of tracks here that do stick more to the traditional sounding electro formulas than that one, they all seem to provide their own very subtle unique twists. Powers of the Deep kinda gives me a similar vibe as Song of the Green Whale from their last album and its mix of dark synth chords and straightforward retro beatwork. Although, this track does have a little more of a sense of progression than that one did, a little more of a sense of building up and down and stuff. And a track like Drexciyan Star Chamber has a more well-layered mix of drum machine beats, subtle, bubbly, melodic textures, and various other bleeping and buzzing effects and experimental synth riffs. Definitely one of the more sonically fleshed out feeling cuts on display here. Gravity Waves is one of the album's more straightforward bangers with thumping beats and quietly but rapidly plucking chords, but the track's actual melodic hook comes through much more in the bass and this other sort of squawking synth texture that almost feel like you're turning a typical Drexciya mix upside down. And Drexciyan R.E.S.T principle, R.E.S.T being an acronym for Research, Experimentation, Science, Technology, of course, that track's the album's most percussion-heavy moment, with all these heavy techno kicks banging away and echoing over each other as the occasional sparse synth chord plucks on top to further add to that sense of groove and propulsion. Hightech Nomads is another particular highlight. It's probably the track that feels most like the kind of ambient techno production that you'd expect to have come out a decade earlier, in all its shifting synth chord pads, classic acid squelching and thumping techno beats that vaguely bring to mind the early artificial intelligence era of IDM in the best way. And while I suppose the album does admittedly lose a bit of steam for me in its final third, there's still some cool ideas here too. The track Ociya Syndor, while not as sonically satisfying as the similarly titled track from Harness the Storm, certainly makes for one of the more interestingly textured mixes on display, combining a lot of odd fuzzy bass riffs, buzzing noises, and off-kilter arpeggios. 700 million light-years from Earth gives the album another somewhat slower and more downbeat moment with all these slightly unnerving and airy pads and some weird, barely melodic whistling texture. It's neat, if not really the kind of track that stands out that much in context. And finally, the album ends in another slightly slower moment, Astronomical Guidepost, which combines the old-school 808 beats with all these various flipping and whooshing experimental synth effects that sound pulled right out of 1991, and effectively add up to the spacey effect they're going for, even featuring a few filtered spoken vocal snippets announcing the status of some ongoing spaceflight. Bit of an uncertain end to this project, but still one that feels sufficiently satisfying. I guess it's like a to-be-continued sort of mystery to end on, though one that still feels right to leave unresolved, given the more cosmic scope of the album in comparison with their other work. Perhaps Earth and Drexciya may find contact, perhaps they may not. We'll never truly know, just as we're unlikely to make contact with intelligent alien life. Solely because the scale of the universe is far too big and sparse and we're too far away from another planet with intelligent life. Not because there isn't any intelligent life out there to begin with. There's probably loads of intelligent life out there, just because of how big the universe is and how many seemingly infinite chances there are for the right conditions to form for intelligent life to thrive. And that's the kind of thoughts that a track like this inserts into my mind. So yeah, Grava 4 is a very good album. I'd still hesitate to say I properly love the album. It's still the kind of thing that at best requires me to be in a certain kind of mood and wasn't the kind of thing I was necessarily itching to jump back into again when it was all done. I still don't think it matches the scale, level of environmental detail, or melodic memorability of the Quest or Neptune's Lair, but it's still cool to see them continue to further explore their sound into even more new territory that they hadn't touched on yet. It is possibly a shame that their story got cut short thanks to James Stinson's unfortunate passing just a few months after Grava 4 was released. But as we'll see when I get to the odds and ends, it's obviously not like both artists didn't deliver plenty of material to make their universe feel all the more lived in. Oh boy, have we gotten no shortage of solo work and side projects from them, even just in James Stinson's lifetime. And in my opinion, Grava 4 makes for a sufficient send-off to their 10 years under their most popular name. Even if it's not their absolute best work, it still feels like they went out while still in their creative peak, and they left with no true redundancy in their catalog. So, for that, I'll give Grava 4 a strong 7.7 out of 10. So there we go. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to edge us off that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.